question in your mind, because there's a lot that we don't know about 1916, or probably ever will know, because the 1916 rising, Easter Monday 1916, April 24th, we can trace the origins of a lot of what happened as far back as we want in Irish history. But in fact, the carrying of that rising lasted all of a day, because the rising that had been intended simply vanished as a possibility on Good Friday and Easter Saturday. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And so the rising that occurred was an improvised rising, whose details were put together on Easter Sunday, 23rd of April, by the signatories of the Proclamation of the Republic, which was read out by Patrick Pearse in front of the General Post Office, the headquarters of the rebels, on Easter Monday. But the whole thing was cobbled together in the light of utterly unexpected circumstances. Nothing had been planned for because the circumstances couldn't have been foreseen. And I'll come back to that also. So this is the historian with huge challenges. And he's a lot of loose threads irrespective of how tightly we try to bind them up. We simply do not know a lot of what happened in the panic conversations between the Redmond leaders. We don't know how they cobbled together the rising that actually happened, which what the rising plan was. There have been a lot of planning for a rising, but not for this rising. So it is the rising of my monarchy that was actually officially cancelled by the heads of volunteers in Redmond, and of course the rest is history and once I talk about it. When we go back years, and I can go back to a number of years here, when we go back to see the genesis of the rising, there's no genesis of that rising. There is a genesis of a rising that didn't occur.
It didn't happen because the plans simply had to be ditched in the light of the arrival of German guns in the ship the Ode, which was meant to deliver 20,000 rifles, 10 machine guns, and several million rounds of ammunition in Kerry, in Fenit, in Kerry. But there was a mix-up in the signals, there was a mix-up in the dates, and the ship had arrived on Holy Thursday. It cruised around for 24 to 36 hours before the British Navy picked it up, and it was brought to Cork, or would have been brought to Cork if the captain hadn't scuttled it on the entrance to Cork Harbour. So the rising that had been anticipated simply did not happen. The rising that happened was an utterly improvised rising decided on at very short notice. And so we can never be absolutely certain about most of what we assert about the actual Easter rising that occurred, because it wasn't the one that anybody had anticipated. Now, let me go back a bit before that. The planning for the rising that didn't happen, actually began about 15 months before, and did anticipate as far as we can figure out, because the documents are sparse and there are contradictions, etc., so you just have to take my word for it, for what it's worth, and lots of people don't, by the way, but that's their problem. The planning for the rising began about 15 months before it. Now, the plan was we must have a rising during the war, during the First World War. Had the First World War been over, as most at the time in August 1914 anticipated it would be over, a short war, because wars, it was thought, could not last for very much longer in this highly industrialized society, and the generals, as generals, I was going to say always, but that's not quite true, almost always are planning for the last war. Nowadays technology is changing so fast, etc., that you have to readjust your planning to take cognizance of that. But as of 1914, the general staffs of pretty well all the belligerents were looking at the wars they knew about. And the two great wars in Europe before 1914 were France and Prussia in 1870, and Austria, the Habsburg Empire, and Prussia in 1866. The French-Prussian War lasted nominally a couple of months, but it was over in a day for practical purposes at the Battle of Sedan, and the 1866 war lasted a day as well. I'm not going to go into those. They're actually extremely interesting battles, but that's not what we're here for. So the generals of 1914 And that includes because the Irish rebels, as they became, are also educated in that concept of what war is going to be like. And they decided, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, secret society, devoted to driving England out of Ireland, basically, decided in September 1914 that they were going to have a rising during the war. Because had the war been over when it was widely anticipated it would be over, they wouldn't have got around to even beginning the planning of the rising. So it's a very complicated situation. If one tries to follow logical thought patterns, etc., in between 1914 and 1916, 1913 and 1916, one will finish up hitting a brick wall because logic doesn't explain what happened. Part of what explains what happened actually occurred in this city, and it occurred in connection with Joe McGarrity, whose papers are out there, or a number of whose papers are out there. And that happened when Patrick Pearse, who was at that time, and I'll come back to Pearse because he's the iconic figure of the revolution of the rising, Pearse came to America for the first and only time, though he meant to come back, but things changed, in February of 1914. And he came down to McGarrity straight away. And it looks to several of us now, and this is thanks to the work of a graduate student in Glucksman Ireland House over the past year and a half. She has traced Pearse's arrival here, his contact with McGarrity, the change or the development of his thinking about a possible rebellion in Ireland in the light of discussion with McGarrity. And I think it's probably fair to say that the genesis of the genesis of the rising would have been in 1916 if that rising had actually occurred, was sown in this city. Because Pearse, who becomes the titular head of the rebellion in 1916, but he's far more than the titular head, and I'll come back to that. Pearse returns to Ireland significantly changed in terms of the not only desirability, but the practicality of a rising. In the event, of course, it didn't turn out like that, but we're talking about expectations and planning about what is going to happen, even though that doesn't happen, in the light of his conversations and discussions with McGarrity. Joe McGarrity is an extremely important figure in the whole background of 1916, and indeed in Irish rebel history, IRA history, etc., during the War of Independence, and in many ways right down to his death. And he remains unchanging and unbending. He was a great friend, colleague, supporter of Eamon de Valera until 1936, when he broke completely with de Valera, because de Valera was banishing the IRA, in effect, out of, or delegitimizing the IRA in terms of de Valera's own concept of how full Irish independence might be achieved. That's another story. We could spend a long time on that, but it is, for me, a privilege to be speaking in a city where the leading member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, where his thinking, his connections, his activities, in fact, played so significant a role in the evolution of Irish rebel politics between 1914 and 1916. And we hope work that's being done in Glucksman Ireland House, as I say, is trying to push that further. There's a volume coming out, I think it's being published on the 1st of December in Dublin, on America and 1916. And one of the key essays, one of the key chapters in that is by this MA student who has done a wonderful piece of digging and has established, it seems to me, irrefutably, the centrality of McGarrity to the whole development that allowed the rising to occur, even if it wasn't the rising they were planning. So let me take it from there in the sense that as of the outbreak of the First World War, there were in Ireland an Ulster volunteer force consisting of Ulster Unionists, primarily Protestant because the divide unfortunately was along religious lines, and there was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, much smaller, but committed to breaking the link with England by rebellion, if possible. And if there was a far larger number of nationalists called Home Rulers under John Redmond, and when the choice came for the vast majority to decide between the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Redmond's party in the summer of 1914, before the war broke out. Redmond won the political battle. The big majority went with him and proceeded into the First World War to fight, insofar as they fought at all, to fight on the British side, on the assumption that Britain would concede home rule, which is a form of, the closest I would compare with in this country would be state government. It was not independence, it was not sovereignty, it was authority over a number of areas that were, in a sense, devolved from the government in London to an Irish parliament, if one wants to call it a parliament. And part of the argument, the Redmondite argument, which was far and away the most popular argument at that stage, simply because I think the vast majority of Irish people could see no possibility whatsoever of trying to rebel against the might of Britain, was that this will evolve. More power will gradually accrue to a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin, and over time we will achieve something approximating full independence. Not a republic, that's not on the table, but a Home Rule genuine government in Ireland, which will allow us, except in matters of defence, because we will be an integral part of British defence planning. But otherwise there would be a very high degree of self-government, but not sovereignty. So there were the complications. I hope I haven't made it. I've tried to simplify it as best I can. There's a lot of rivulets running around, and that remained the situation as the war broke out. But then the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the small group, I have to stress small group, maybe 10% of those who responded to the competing pleas of Redmond and Home Rule and of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, only a small number, comparatively speaking, 10%, went with the IRB as of August and September 1914. It did not mean that the 170,000 others volunteered for the British Army. Maybe 30,000 did. But the vast majority were either too old or too sceptical or too careful to actually join the British Army, but they were supportive of the British role in the war. And that remained the case until 1916. The support became more tepid as the casualties rose, Irish casualties rose, and maybe the figure is disputed, but maybe about 40,000 Irish died in the war, in the British Army, between 1914 and 1918, of course. And the sea change in attitude really did not definitively come until the Easter Rising and the aftermath of the Easter Rising. The Easter Rising is the crucial catalyst for the shift in Irish public opinion, a dramatic shift from support for Home Rule and for Redmond to support for whatever the Republican alternative was. And the Republicans were, I'd have to say, canny enough never to make it crystal clear what the alternative was, because they knew they were going to be, at some stage, they were going to be confronted with the might of Britain, or the potential might. If Britain chose to punch her full military weight, then if it was a one-to-one situation, there was no way whatsoever the IRA, as they turned out to be from 1919 on, could have defeated the British Army. So what emerged in 1921-22 as the treaty settlement between the 26 counties of the partitioned island and Britain was the compromise struck as a result of the War of Independence, and how much could Britain suffer in a sense, how much could she tolerate in terms of Irish independence. And the Treaty of 1921, which established a government in Dublin with pretty well full independence, even though there's nominal obeisance of the Crown. That is the outcome of decisions taken in Dublin, obviously, in London, and I will argue briefly I better watch how long I'm talking for, because I can go on interminably, as you may have already deduced. The Washington's position. Now, what happened after the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, broke with Redmond in the fall of 1914, First World War broke out, was a very gradual, slow development of support for the Republic, the idea of a Republic as distinct from Home Rule. Very gradual, and we can tell from recruitment figures that, however, it begins not so much support for the Republic as a decline in enthusiasm for the war. Begins around the middle of 1915. But that still doesn't express itself in support for a Republic. It was just, we're getting killed. What are we getting killed for? How long is this bloody war going to last? We were told to be over by Christmas. Are we now simply condemning ourselves to the possibility of death, etc.? Gallipoli was happening, of course, in 1915, and the news from Gallipoli wasn't good. And public enthusiasm for the war had become distinctly tepid by 1916 itself. The 1916 Rising occurs in a country which is still supporting the war in general, but where there's a lot of uncertainty about, is this the right way to go? And the speed with which public opinion changed after the Rising, and particularly after the executions, the speed with which it changed into support for whatever the Rising represented. And that could mean a lot of different things to different people. The speed is really quite remarkable. It probably wouldn't have happened the way it did, and I'll come back to this, if the British hadn't chosen to execute the leaders. You can say it's the executions, more than the Rising itself, that began swinging public opinion against alliance, as that effectively was what it was, with Britain, or against support for the British war effort. And recruitment dries up very significantly between the middle of 1916, or from the Rising on, you can say, until the last couple of months of the war, when there is a small rise, but at a very low level, and is partly related to the advent of air war, air power, etc., and of people getting excited about the idea of doing something in the air. But from the middle of 1916, from just after the Rising, the response begins to become clear, recruitment drops spectacularly. That's the outline. But now let me go back to, and then in 1918, Sinn Féin win a staggering electoral victory in the election called immediately after the war, and proceed from there to establish Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, etc., and the parliamentary party, the Home Rule Party, vanishes. Dramatic shifts there. Now, let me go back earlier on and try and fill in a sense, that's what happened. But nobody could have predicted that. If you say in January 1916, one had asked, how is this war going to go? Nobody, outside a very small number, were anticipating a Rising, obviously, and what you had was resignation to the inevitability of this damn thing ploughing on and on and on, but no alternative in sight. The Rising that was planned was a very different Rising than the one that occurred, simply because it was dependent on the arrival of German guns. And a lot of that planning for that happened in this city also, by the way, because Roger Casement, who was intimately involved, was also very friendly with McGarrity and spent quite a bit of time here. Philadelphia plays, in terms of the people who were there and of the roles they played, Philadelphia is grossly underwritten, shall we say, in terms of Irish historiography, Irish American historiography, and that's being partly realized, but only partly, by this book that will come out in December. The plan for the Rising was that when the German guns arrived, now 20,000 rifles is 20,000, but you can argue that in normal circumstances that wouldn't be nearly enough to cope with superior British power, etc. But at least that was going to come. The Germans had played, they didn't know whether they wanted or didn't know whether they should or they shouldn't, etc. There was a lot of discussion within German decision-making circles about whether these Irish were worth supporting at all. would their guns simply fall into British hands and all the rest of it. But they did send the ship. It arrived in Tralee Bay, but it arrived 36 hours or 2 days too early because the rebel leaders in Dublin changed the date from Holy Thursday to Easter Sunday, on which they wanted the guns to arrive. Unfortunately, they didn't check out whether the Ode actually had radio or not. So the message never reached the Ode because it had sailed before the change of mind in Dublin. So what the rebels plotting a rebellion that they thought was going to be countrywide or half countrywide are faced with on Easter Saturday and Easter Sunday is the collapse of their planned rising. And that's when they decide, the signatories of the Proclamation of the Republic decide on Easter Sunday that they're going to go ahead with whoever comes out. Owen MacNeill, the head of the Volunteers, but not a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which you can say is the precursor of the Irish Republican Army, MacNeill gets to hear about it. There are stories back and forth. I'm not going to go into the details of who's lying to whom about what, because everybody's lying in some stage, in some sort of way, virtually. But he cancels the planned manoeuvres, because that's all that the rebels have advertised. There will be manoeuvres on Easter Sunday. So the men who are going to come out on Easter Sunday were actually not told this was the real thing. This was manoeuvres to commence on Easter Sunday morning, etc. When you woke up on Easter Sunday morning and got your copy of the Sunday Independent, the biggest mass circulation paper, you discovered that MacNeill had an announcement in there cancelling the manoeuvres planned. And so the signatories of the proclamation and the real IRB leaders, etc., meet and decide we're going ahead. We're going ahead even though our plans, in effect, are shattered. There is no way we can have a countrywide rising now, or even half a countrywide rising. We are, in effect, going to our death. They had drawn up the Proclamation of the Republic, probably the most famous document in Irish history, addressed to Irish men and Irish women, starting off. The first mention of women in a main political document in Irish history. And they decide on Easter Sunday morning that they are going to rise on Easter Monday, the following day, which had the advantage that it was the Ferry House races, which was the biggest racing spectacle in Ireland, Ferry House about 20 miles outside Dublin, and the British Officer Corps in Ireland, such as it was almost certainly going to be mainly at the races, as distinct from wondering about what trouble could be brewing internally. And that's the way it happened. So the rising plan for Easter Sunday never happened. The rising plan for Easter Monday was a product of a 24-hour, if that, alternative substitute cobbled together in the face of inevitable, inescapable defeat by 7 men who did not know how many would come out the following day, by trying to get news around that the rising is going ahead, etc., etc. They seized a number of key buildings, or what they saw as key buildings in the centre of the city. They didn't seize a lot more that had been planned for seizing had the rising gone ahead as originally anticipated. So they're digging themselves in, waiting to be blown out of it, which is what happens in the various buildings, etc., and hang in there as long as you can. That's what the Easter Rising was. It was simply an operation by the British Army, or at least by the British Army. Troops were sent across from England at high speed, obviously, and there are probably 20,000 troops in the city against maybe 1,500 rebels by the end of the week, and they just systematically demolish the buildings in which the rebels have barricaded themselves. And on Easter Saturday, Patrick Pearse, the leader of the rising, the President of the Republic, I'll come back to the leader of the rising, the President of the Republic surrenders and insists on surrender for all the garrisons, or all the buildings seized, some of which were very reluctant because they had not faced the full brunt of British firepower as yet. De Valera, who was in charge of Boland's Mills, De Valera refused to surrender without the authorization of his immediate commanding officer. De Valera had a very punctilious sense of hierarchical propriety. His immediate commanding officer was Thomas MacDonagh, not Patrick Pearse, and he refused to surrender until MacDonagh's signature was on the surrender note. A couple of others surrendered, Eamon Cant in particular, with great reluctance. But they had, by Easter Sunday, by later on Easter Sunday, the rising was over. There were a few hundred casualties on both sides. More civilians were killed, as it so happens, than military. And that was it. And then the British made their fatal mistake. They went ahead with executions. They executed all the signatories of the Proclamation of the Republic, and they executed those they deemed to be leaders, so that 14 were executed in Dublin, another one killed in Cork, etc. And, of course, Casement was hung in Pentonville a few months afterwards. So that's it. The rising is over. The centre of Dublin has taken a hell of a beating, shall we say. There's a lot of destruction in the centre of Dublin because the British simply fired. They brought their guns up the Liffey, heavy artillery, and just demolished whatever buildings they knew that there were rebels in, and whatever else happened to be in the vicinity, basically, because you can't guide shells, necessarily to the target you want. So it appeared that here you have a futile, utterly futile rising by what has been called a minority of a minority. And one of the great unanswerable questions of Irish history is, what would have happened if the executions hadn't occurred? And we can never know the answer to that. But you begin seeing public opinion turning halfway through the week after the surrender. And I've been through, God knows, so many newspapers, etc., which are strongly condemnatory of the rising for the most part when it's going on. Or at least they're condemnatory of what they think is a rising because they know very little about it. Very few newspapers are published, none in Dublin, beyond sort of a very simplified Irish Times for part of the time. The country doesn't know what's going on. And in fact, the editors are saying that in their newspapers. Quite simply, we simply don't know what's going on. We're as dependent on rumour as in the days of '98 and of Robert Emmet. So we are, in a sense, locked out from what's happening in our country. But of course it shouldn't be happening. There's a bunch of rebels. Now, Germans were seen around the place. The number of Irish who saw Germans in the Easter week 1916, is amazing. Easter week was almost a closed week in terms of Irish knowledge of what was happening in Dublin. There were a couple of small skirmishes outside Dublin, but Dublin was the epicentre. Once the executions began, one can sense a sea change in public opinion. Not yet in the sense of supporting the rising, but in the sense of saying, well, they shouldn't have done it. Let's say the rebels shouldn't have done it, but they were brave lads, and they don't deserve to be executed like this on basically drumhead courts. And 1 week afterward, you can see the change of tone throughout the bulk of the press, where it has shifted from initial condemnation, initial German conspiracy, etc., to, well, it was a mistake, but it was a gallant mistake, to, maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe the mistake was being defeated. Maybe the rising would have been fine if only there was a chance of success. And that continues on for the next 2 years, until in the general election of 1918, December 1918, at the end of the war, Sinn Féin, which becomes associated with the rising, even though it wasn't a Sinn Féin rising in the sense of the organisation Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith wasn't involved at all. Sinn Féin wins 73 seats out of 105 in the general election. The Irish Parliamentary Party, the Constitutional Party, John Redmond's party, Redmond himself has died shortly before it, wins 6 seats. And the rest go to Unionists, Northern Ireland, etc. So the rising, and even more the British response to the rising, transform Irish public opinion. And remember, 1918 is the first election in which women have the vote in Great Britain and Ireland, because even the British government couldn't refuse the demand for the vote when women had played so prominent a role in munitions factories and like that in the course of the war. So the first general election that was on an adult suffrage, now women still had to be over 30, by the way. Irish women get to vote at 21 in 1922 in our first constitution, which is 6 years before women under 30 get the vote in Britain, by the way, in 1928, and in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So you can see how progressive Irish thinking was on the place of women in Irish political society. Now that can be, we leave that for another day. But as far as the vote is concerned, Irish women over 21 had the vote from 1922 on, and Irish women over 30 had the vote from 1918 on. And they vote overwhelmingly for Sinn Féin in the South. Now, all right, that's an overview. I hope it makes some sort of sense, because I want to go back and say a few things about the might-have-beens, the what-ifs, the uncertainties, and how what happened emerged from a variety of possible things that could have happened. There's no straight line in a way. There's a myriad of smaller things happening that come together, but come together in a way that whose denouement is not crystal clear at the time they're coming together. So it was quite possible the rising wouldn't have happened at all. In other words, the rebels who decide they're going ahead, knowing they're signing their death warrant in a way, have committed themselves so much that in a way their sense of personal honour and their sense of not being made look fools by having gone so far and then pulled back at the end, that is a decision that was arrived at unanimously by the 7 signatories of the proclamation. But we'll never know what the arguments were back and forth at that meeting in Liberty Hall on Easter Sunday morning. And we don't know what would have happened if a number of things that could have happened had happened. For instance, at the end, when they knew they were defeated, Tom Clark, who was the senior Fenian rebel, to whom everybody normally deferred, Tom Clark did not want to surrender. He wanted to die fighting. For the only time that we're aware of, he was overruled by the titular head, the titular president, who was Patrick Pearse. The one occasion on which Pearse, in fact, asserted his rank against that of the man who was the real backbone and founder of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in its active phase from 1910 on. And to the question that I would put, it's not a question that has been put in the historiography, why does Pearse surrender? Pearse was the president. He'd been, in a sense, appointed by Clark as president of the Republic. And he, in a sense, insists on the surrender. And it is said, and said rightly, I think, that the 3 civilians who were coming out under a white flag, etc., were mown down by British gunfire, and that Pearse's conscience or whatever revolted and said, we can't have any more innocent civilians killed in this way if the shooting goes on, and we have no chance of victory, therefore we surrender. Tom Clark did not want to surrender. He wanted to die fighting. And here I'm purely speculating, by the way. You've no idea how original a lot of this is, come to think of it. All right, but it's right or not a different matter entirely, but it's the way I see it happening, but otherwise there aren't really compelling interpretations, it seems to me, of what happened. Pearse was an extraordinary personality. Pearse is in many ways a stage director. In his school, St. Enda's, he put enormous emphasis on plays, on the pupils doing their plays. He had his school perform in the Abbey. Yeats, he became sufficiently familiar with Yeats for Yeats to allow him to have Scoilena school, Scoilena dramas, or dramas by the pupils of Scoilena, played in the Abbey. Pearse reads the Proclamation of the Republic. Clark picks him to do so. And Pearse is the president, although meant to be a purely nominal position. But what Pearse had, and this is why I think Pearse is actually central to the rising as it turned out, Pearse had a sense of drama. Scoilena, St. Linda's School, was renowned for being the school in Ireland whose pupils presented most dramas, as I said. In the centre of drama, he had a sense of, he had a vision which you could not put into neat squares and boxes on paper, but which sensed possibilities that others simply did not sense. And we then have to come back to Clark and ask, why does Clark have Pearse appointed President of the Republic? What did Pearse have that Clark himself didn't have? It was the old Fenian. It spent 15 years, if I remember rightly, in penal servitude before he came over here. He was consumed with hatred of Britain, perfectly understandable in the circumstances. But he wants Pearse to be president. Now, the only reason I can think of why Pearse should have been president in the context was Pearse was renowned as a communicator. He was a very effective orator. He was a drafter of very potent documents. The Proclamation of the Republic is mostly, and you can see his style in it, is mostly his. But why do you need a great communicator in a rebel situation? You need a great communicator, you've got somebody to communicate to. So Clark, in my view, is actually anticipating a much longer rising on the basis of what they had planned up till the Easter Sunday, when Pearse had already been nominated as president. In other words, Pearse is appointed president of the Republic for a very different republic to the one that appeared to be realistic the day after. But Pearse stays there, and he spends Easter week in the General Post Office composing proclamations and documents, announcements. He probably never fired a shot during the rising. But he is the man you go to with a pen in his hand who can compose messages that will rouse public support. Clark did not want to surrender on Easter Saturday, or not Easter Saturday, the Saturday of the week after, when the surrender came. He didn't want to surrender. For the only time in his life, Pearse was in a position to overrule him as president, and brought the others with him. Now, Pearse knew, and this is why Pearse, I think, is central to the impact of the rising. You can have any views you like about his views on anything you like, but in terms of how do we optimize the psychic impact of the drama and the tragedy that is occurring and will continue to occur, because Pearse was under no illusions but he would be executed. Pearse, as a communicator to a wider world, and particularly to America, could have composed messages that would have struck home and might have struck home. And remember, America is potentially, in my view, a central consideration in the thinking of the rebels, even though it doesn't come out like that. But there's a presidential election year. If the rising goes on for any length of time and isn't crushed within a few days, which is why the British were so intent on crushing it fully and leaving no trace behind, so to speak, then Irish America gets pulled into, dragged into, or whatever it is, or jumps into the situation. And Anglo-American relations become an issue at a time when England is desperate to get America into the war. Now, that may appear far-fetched, but there is actually a logical connection between those particular calculations. They're not on paper. There's no document which says here are the reasons why. But if you're trying to reconstruct why do people act the way they do in those circumstances, and you try to reconcile their actions with your assessment of their personality, then that is, for me, that's the most compelling interpretation I can put on the way the rising ended. And the way it ended, with the executions following, then becomes the foundation stone of the new Republican movement. But of course, there's nothing on paper about that. And it may be completely nonsense. Every single supposition in that, in my head, may simply be wrong. But it is the suppositions are not incompatible with everything else we know about the main personalities involved. There's a huge difference, it seems to me, in the potential impact on public opinion of the executions drawn out over nearly 10 days, but of course James Connolly strapped and wounded, dying from his wounds, strapped in the chair to be executed, in case he fell out before they got the bullets into him. Big difference between that and the boys dying, or being killed, fighting to the last bullet, etc., etc. You turn over another corpse, and it turns out to be Pearse or Clark or whoever it is, well, so what? You put them in front of a firing squad, day in, day out, and you can begin sensing the tone of public opinion changing. Now, I can't say, because there's no documentary evidence, I can say that Pearse had worked that through in his own mind, and therefore insisted on surrender, knowing that surrender meant execution. And obviously, they're not writing about these things when they're in jail awaiting execution. But otherwise, there are decisions taken, and nobody's explored this so far, by the way. Please God, somebody will and may overturn certain what I'm saying. But as far as the documentary evidence as of now is concerned, everything I'm saying is compatible with such evidence as there is, which doesn't mean to say it is right. But you are, willingly or unwillingly, the first recipients. Oh God, isn't this being recorded? I'm not sure this should go further than this room, as a matter of fact. Let's leave it. There is far more, it seems to me, in the surrender, the mechanics of surrender, the psychology of surrender, the decision to surrender, which should be seen as an integral part of the IRB's thinking, or the rebel thinking, about the consequences of what we're doing. Given that what we hoped we would be doing clearly never got off the ground, didn't have a chance, but can we salvage something from the wreckage of our plans? And the British were, as has happened elsewhere from time to time, the British were sufficiently stupid to actually play the game that was conceived for them in Pearse's mind. Now, I can't demonstrate that, obviously. But by the 14th or 15th of May, it was clearly the public opinion had swung around, if not in favour of the rising choir rising, but in favour of the rebels. And there will be another day. And there was. So thank you very much for bearing so patiently. With a purely speculative presentation. If anybody wants to ask a few questions or whatever, draw my attention to anything, I'm quite happy to try and respond. Yourself?
Could you explain, okay, so the communications didn't get to the ship.
Yep.
Left.
Yep.
The 30,000 guns on
Yep.
from Germany.
Yep.
What happened?
What happened? The Ode arrived in Finet. Finet is the port of Tralee, off the coast of Kerry. It arrived on Holy Thursday. It expected to be greeted by signals, etc., which told it where the guns would be landed, and to have IRB men there waiting for them. It hadn't got the message to wait till Easter Sunday. Whether that was feasible or not, I do not know. Had they got the message in time, but they didn't get the message at all, because it was delivered. I mean, this was pure amateurism on the part of Dublin and Signals. They cruised for somewhere up to 36 hours. Now, the irony was that there were signals sent. And here I become protective of my inheritance, because I actually come from the village from which the signals were sent in West Kerry. The problem was the signal for the Ode was 2 green flashes. The number 1 signaller had, and this has never been explained, had dropped out. And there was a reserve signaller, right, who had been told that the signal was 1 green flash. So he kept flashing 1 green light at the Ode for several hours. The Ode kept ignoring it. It was the wrong signal. Now, they were then picked up by the British Navy. And the British knew that something was happening. And they sent warships and diverted them from Cork, etc. And they captured the Ode and forced this is on the, I don't know if we have a map of Ireland behind us. So they went around Kerry, went around the south coast, the coast of Cork, etc. The captain of the Ode scuttled the ship at the entrance to Cork Harbour. So within 10 miles of Cork is a wonderful harbour for anybody who knows it, but 10 miles out, the captain scuttled the ship. So the guns, the equipment, everything is somewhere at the bottom of Cork Harbour still. Right? So that's what happened there. Now, there are elements of farce at one level. I mean, sublime to the ridiculous in many ways. Terence MacSwiney, who would of course die in hunger strike a few years later, was in charge of the Cork contingent, who were to march to the Kerry border to pick up the Ode's guns for use in Cork. Well, first of all, they get drenched because you know what Cork skies can be like. Then no guns came. So it was farce in a sense. It was farce, or at least it was impotent nonsense. Everywhere else people went to get guns that just weren't there. And there was quite a bit of number of them on the west coast. The guns were to be distributed up through Limerick, through Clare, into Lee Mellows and Galway. Or some were to be kept, obviously. The west coast and Cork were to be pretty well equipped. I've never found any piece of evidence, nor has anybody else, as to how many were to go elsewhere. So there's uncertainty about how tight the planning was in terms of distribution of the guns. Nevertheless, had they come ashore, it was a very interesting situation, because Britain had to decide very quickly what to do if in fact there's a substantial armed hostile force in the country. What do you do if you're English in those circumstances? The war is not going all that well in France. Do you bring troops back from France to crush it at all costs, which meant utter savagery? You know, if Britain's existence is deemed to be at stake, which it probably wouldn't have been, but nevertheless it was very tight. Would they have offered John Redmond home rule on the spot and tried to deal with Ulster Unionists in whatever way you deal with Ulster Unionists in those circumstances? What would the British cabinet have decided? I'd love to have known. So anyway, there's huge uncertainties. Yourself and yourself. Jesus, yes, okay, all right.
My name is Joseph Lennon. I'm the director of the Center for Irish Studies, and I just wanted to welcome everybody to Villanova also, and thank you all for being here. This is a wonderful event where we are working with the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick to host Joseph Lee here. And Joe Lee is a great inspiration to many Irish scholars, Irish studies scholars, for generations. But I have one question for you, and it's about public relations. Mm-hmm. Do you think that, I mean, your argument is sort of hinging on this, that Pearse had a mind for PR and thinking about public opinion? Absolutely, absolutely. I think he had it going back a long time, and one can see it. I mean, there are many Pearses, you know. The question is, you know, for the historian, which Pearse is actually in the ascendant at any particular moment. Pearse is a very elusive character, because he writes some of the most bloodthirsty prose you can find in the writings of Irish revolutionaries, and he also writes some of the most conciliatory prose that you can find in the writings of Irish revolutionaries. And therefore you have to ask all the time which Pearse is surfacing at this particular moment. Why is it this Pearse who's surfacing now, as distinct from the other Pearses who are around the place? Pearse, I've sometimes been asked, how would the 1916 leaders have voted on the Treaty of 1921, which in effect created the Irish Free State and gave self-government to the south. It accepted the partition of Ireland, which had been... See, the British introduced partition in December of 1920. The British in effect hive off Northern Ireland before they come to actually do a deal with the rebels. But they've already taken care of Ulster Unionism before they set around to doing a deal with the Republicans. I would be very confident Tom Clark would have voted against the treaty. Pearse, I just don't know. Because there's enough in Pearse to say half loaf is better than no bread.
He had compromised in 1907 on the Council's bill. The Council's bill was a piece of English legislation which was withdrawn in the event, which gave some very limited home rule to certain aspects of Irish policy making, and would have allowed the Home Rule Party to actually to have implemented those. It was so deemed to be so moderate, so unsatisfactory, that John Redmond rejected it. Pearse actually wanted it accepted. Now, he wasn't in politics at that time. Why did he want it accepted? Because it gave us control over our own education. And once we have control over education, we can mould the mind of the youth. So here you have the man who is probably identified or personalised as the most iconic extremist, saying in 1907, let's take this, not a half loaf, it's a half a slice, but let's take it. We can work with this, and we can change the mind of a nation over time. In 1915, he's saying, look, we can't jettison possible deals with the British government. The British government is wobbly, and indeed it was, because Asquith had to take Bonar Law and the Tories into government in May of 1915. The British government is very uncertain at this moment. Let us not strike a definitive posture, simply rejecting anything they're going to do. They may do something that we can actually exploit. He's a much more, in other words, to cite Pearse's most extreme statements, and they are extreme, and say this is Pearse, is to rip him out of his own context completely. Pearse is a much more malleable tactician than he's normally given the credit or discredit for, as the case may be. And so if somebody asks me, how do you think Pearse would have voted on the treaty? Now, that's holding everything else constant, sort of in the intervening years and all the rest of it. I have to say, quite honestly, I do not know. And that's why I refrain from, I admire Pearse enormously, by the way, that's a different matter entirely, even though I disagree with a lot of what he did, a lot of his decisions. But there's a mind there that is looking for alternatives, looking for different way forwards, and which is saying, look, the one thing we have in common is that we're Irish. We can work things out among ourselves if we get a chance to do so. But to get a chance to do so, we have to either break British resistance to that idea, or we have to somehow acquire, by stealth almost, command of those areas that we can build on ourselves. Now, he's also, I have to say, there's also, I don't want to say a death wish or a sacrifice wish, though sometimes you might think there is, I mean, in Pearse. And you'll know, Joe, I mean, there are many Pearses in the prose. But I go back, and wait a minute, let me just quote something here, because I had a long thing on Pearse, which I'm not going to inflict on you, but I want to quote something that he wrote 2 months before his death. We can find it here. And it makes one think, it seems to me, oh, sugar, I read the wrong thing in. Just as well I didn't read from my text, it was the wrong text. Right? But he has a piece 2 months before his death, after they've decided on the rising. The rising is going to happen. Okay, or a rising is going to happen. He's a piece defending Thomas Davis, the young Irelander who died at the age of 30 back in 1845, defending him against his Republican critics, his contemporary, his 1916 Republican critics, who dismissed Davis because he did not believe in physical force, if at all possible. Right? And Pearse says, let it not be a criticism of Davis. If a country is able to achieve its freedom without using force, it is its duty to do so. Those of us who believe, then he goes on, those of us who believe that in Irish circumstances it is impossible to achieve that, will have to concede this to Davis. And he makes it quite clear that there, and here he is taking on probably the 6 other signatories of what became the proclamation, etc., etc. He is speaking in the face of a lot of IRB sentiment. He's simply saying, look, in the circumstances of the time, maybe there was a chance, and good luck to Davis. And there are other things in Pearse. This is why I say Pearse is so difficult to say definitively, this is the Pearse, as distinct from a variety of possible Pearses depending on his reading of situations. In the end, and this is why I do think there was a rising on Easter Monday, I think one of the main reasons why on that Easter Sunday meeting, the signatories of the Proclamation of the Republic decided that we were going to have a rising, is they reckoned they were all for arrest as soon as the British officer corps came back from the Curragh. And therefore, do we now go down in ignominy that, we have failed to stand up when we've marched the troops ahead of we've marched them to the top of the hill and now we're marching back down again. So I think a lot of personal pride, who am I? Have I roused people? Have I brought people out? Have I, etc., trained them for a battle, and when, although the circumstances aren't the ones that we anticipated, when that battle looms, we run. I think there's a lot of that. Now, you can't obviously demonstrate that in terms of you're into individual psychology, you're into things here, but these seem to me to be factors that at least have to be confronted. And there is no definitive answer. I'm sorry, I'm going on like nobody's business, but anyway, that's the balance of probabilities. Yep.
Question, after 100 years, as I understand it, the 16 rebel leaders who signed the proclamation, for many, many years they've been controversial. They were not considered heroes, at least by the mainstream in Ireland. What's the state now? Is there a consensus that those 16 were heroes? And then, not misguided people who... It
depends who you're talking to. And there would be a strong feeling among so-called revisionist historians that basically Irish history oughtn't have happened the way it happened. If only we had settled for the Normans in 1169 and we could all have lived happily ever after, etc. No, my understanding of it would be this. That's of Irish public opinion. Until the 1960s, maybe even until the late 60s, there was a general acceptance of the heroism, etc., and the good intentions, etc., of the rebels. Then, when the Northern Troubles broke out, now there were some critics, but they were marginal. When the Northern Troubles broke out from 68, 69 on, a number of people either jumped on the bandwagon to use that to try to denigrate the consequences of 1916 and the War of Independence, or for the first time began to say, hey, if that's what that led to, look at the mess we're in now, innocent people getting killed, etc., etc. Maybe that wasn't a very wise way to go about things. Now, that didn't turn into denunciation, but it was certainly a retreat from uncritical admiration. And that would have remained until the Good Friday Agreement, I think, in 1998, which was largely done under American, I won't say tutelage, American guidance. And George Mitchell, etc., had to give an ultimatum that I'm not coming back to you, Shore, once again, if you can't sort it out. And they got it sorted out. Bill Clinton, I'm told, was roused in his bed, or at least in somebody's bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, to say that he understood the agreement, which of course he hadn't seen, that he understood it to mean exactly what George Mitchell said it meant. Now, however, there has been, I think, a significant change in the last few years, back in the general direction of strong admiration for the 1916 rebels, not amongst so-called revisionist historians who are still blaming everything in sight or blaming 1916 for everything that's gone wrong with Ireland, right? And there's a lot of ideology involved in this, and a lot of, I won't go into names or anything else like that. But the reason I cite, I'll just give 2 reasons, and then I better shut up. Last year, 2015, the then government, which would have been, how shall I put it, the more moderate side, might be, many would say, the proper descendant of the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Redmond's people. They, I think, thought they could get the centenary, in a sense, under control this year by closing O'Connell Street, the main street in Dublin, by closing O'Connell Street for Easter Monday of last year. And so no traffic, etc., etc. Radio Éireann in Henry Street beside the General Post Office, and all the theatres, the Abbey Theatre down a few hundred yards the other direction, etc., were to run shows, interviews, discussions, etc., with prominent public figures, not excluding historians, and have it talked, have the rising talked about it, and that is our obeisance to it, and that means that we can get away next year with a moderate, if you like, controlled centenary. Now, I was told, I haven't been on O'Connell Street that day myself, and I was told that that government expectations, now I've only this on hearsay, so government expectations that maybe 20, 25,000 people would turn up. Now, it turned out to be a beautiful day. I remember being on O'Connell Street, and I thought to myself, I don't know how many are here, but at the damn site more than 15 to 25,000. And I was told afterwards the police estimate was at least 100,000 and maybe 150,000, because you count people coming and going and all this sort of stuff, how many people you're counting twice, 3 times and whatnot. But O'Connell Street was jam-packed from O'Connell statue down to Parnell statue at the far end. And I think that actually gave the government such a shock. They said, cripes, you know, there's going to be a big commemoration next year. We better put ourselves ahead of it, which they did. And this year's commemoration, I happen to be in Dublin for Easter Monday this year, it was incredibly popular, that's all I can say. It was, yes, there was, you know, the army was there and the bigwigs were there, etc., but there was, the spontaneity of it was self-evident. And I myself went to hear a lecture. The Department of Foreign Affairs put on, I think, 7 lectures over 7 hours, etc., on various topics in Irish history. I went to hear one of them, and the place, it's a hall that holds 400 maybe, standing room only. And I was told that every single one, from when they began at 10 o'clock in the morning down to whenever they closed, standing room only. A lady in Glucksman Ireland House, who was actually a tremendous lady, she was back in Ireland. She took her father to the National Library, because the National Library was also giving an exhibition. They couldn't get in. How many times can you say of a National Library anywhere that, you know, it's not even standing room only, you just can't get in, because there's such interest in the documentation that was laid out to do with the Rising. And that certainly gelled with everything I saw and observed on that Easter Monday. Now, it was a beautiful day, by the way, and this is a rare event in Ireland at that time of year, maybe any bloody time of year, but anyway. But there was colossal popular support for having a commemoration worthy of what was clearly widely seen as the fundamental sort of event in our history. And that I think has continued. And I'm only back from Ireland a week or 2 weeks ago. There is certainly a sense of, I think, pride. Not necessarily a sense of approval of every single thing that happened or everything else like that, but a sense, I found Ireland very comfortable this summer. When I say comfortable, I mean a psychological comfort. You know, we've been through a lot, right? We've come out this side. We're still in a bad way, not quite as bad as we were economically and so on. Immigration is still high, although declining and whatnot. But there was a sense, I think we were at ease with ourselves in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime. And that itself is very interesting, because 20 years ago, revisionism, historical revisionism, was all the rage. Media was consumed by it. Historians, even bloody historians, who ought to have known better, were consumed by it. Which is not to say, I'm sorry, which is not to say that there aren't things that shouldn't be revised by. That's a different matter. Okay, and this will be the last one then, okay?
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on that. During the 70s and 80s, to a large extent, growing up in Ireland at the time, it wasn't that we rejected 1916 so much as that the Republicans in the North claimed to be the followers on and claimed their own justification from 1916. And to a certain extent, in rejecting that, people stood away from 1916. It wasn't that they rejected 1916 themselves, they just didn't want to align themselves terribly much with the
the physical force republicanism in the North. And that it wasn't a rejection of 1916 so much as wanting to do.
No, I think that's a fair general point, although I would say that there were those who definitely wanted to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I mean, there were,
Yeah.
but the general public.
Yes.
Like,
No, I think,
there were
yeah.
professional historians who had their
Yeah.
position in that.
I think that's fair comment. Okay, can we call it an evening or whatever it is? It's oh, no, thank you very much. Thank you very much.